How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another video here on the Not Automotive channel. And before the actual video starts, I wanted to just take a minute to explain the content and the timing of why this video is coming out now. So as some of you might know, I sold my C55 back in August, and that was when I filmed this video about a few weeks before I sold the car. And I filmed this video using my iPhone, and since then I've had a ton of trouble trying to get the files off of my iPhone to my PC where I do all of my video editing. And for some reason, plugging my phone in directly to the computer was just not working very well. It was having issues connecting and transferring files. Tried doing like Google Photos, blah, blah, blah. So I finally found a way using the iMovie app on your phone to just condense the files and do it. It's not a really efficient way, but it got the job done because I wanted to get this video out there. So this is me maybe throwing a question out to you guys. If any of you know how to efficiently transfer specifically larger video files from your iPhone to a PC, please let me know and I would greatly appreciate it. But yeah, so enjoy this video, guys. This was my last video that I filmed with the C55 doing this driving review, and I took this car on some really fun twisty canyon back roads down here in San Diego. I sure had a lot of fun, so I hope you guys enjoyed the content. So a video I've been meaning to do on the C55 for quite a while now is a driving review video. Now I think this car is very unique. It's a pretty rare car, believe it or not. There was only about 1,300 imported into the US between the 2 years it was made in 2005 and 2006. So people that are looking to buy this car, I know I was in this situation, often want to know how it drives. So today I've got a list of different points I want to talk about related to the overall driving experience on the C55. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, I got about 8 different things on this list related to the overall driving experience of this car. And the first one is the most probably highly talked about aspect of any driving feel of a car, is the power and torque feel. And I will say a disclaimer that this car is not completely stock. It's got some performance mods. So if you're getting a C55, you know, this car will perform a little bit differently, but for the most part, it's still about the same. Stock, the C55 has about 360 horsepower, 375 foot-pounds of torque. This one, with the performance mods I've done, I'm probably running about 410, 415 horsepower and about 400 foot-pounds of torque. So it's very similar, but it just adds a little bit extra to the stock feel. But another cool factor with the C55 is that this car produces 300 foot-pounds of torque at just 2,000 RPM, so very low in the rev range that this car produces its torque figure. Like, oh man, it's just enough power to push you back in the seat and kind of give you that thrill. But this car has a naturally aspirated M113 V8 from Mercedes, and it was their V8 that they use in all the 55 series cars, so it's a very widely used engine. And in my reliability video, I mentioned how robust and strong this drivetrain is. But the moral of the story with the power and torque feel of this car is, you know, in today's standards, 360, 400 might not seem like a lot. Like a lot of cars from today's day and age, they're coming with 500-600 horsepower from the factory, even 700 if you're looking at like the Hellcats and stuff. But with 360 or 400-ish, it's a very usable amount of power that you can kind of wring this engine out on the streets and have fun with without getting into a crazy amount of trouble at high speeds. You can really wring this thing out in the low gears and, you know, you're still driving pretty safe. Like, you can accelerate hard and then it's, you know, it gives you that thrill and it pushes you back in the seat. And it's a really fun experience. And like I said, the fact that the engine produces 300 foot-pounds of torque at just 2,000 RPM and the red line's at 6,500, you experience the high torque figure or higher torque figure very low in the RPM range, so you're feeling that very often. So it's a great car with power, very usable amount of power that isn't boring. It's still fun. There have been times where, like when I've been daily driving the car a lot, you sometimes do get accustomed to the power, but that's going to happen to any car you drive often, regardless of how much power it has, unless you're talking over 1,000 maybe. But So you will maybe get a little bit used to the power, and then that's when you could do some performance mods. But it's a very fun, usable amount of power that won't get you in a lot of trouble. And I will say, so if you haven't seen my performance mods video, go check that out. But the performance mods I didn't add a ton of horsepower, so it added maybe 50-60 horsepower at the crank. But what the biggest change that those mods did to the driving experience of this car related to the power and torque feel is, and the throttle feel, is it really made this car more lively. It made the throttle response a lot better. It felt more like active, because I have the airbox and the header, so it helps the car to breathe better. But overall, the power and torque feel of this car is really fun, and it's a usable amount of power that won't get you in a bunch of trouble. The next topic on the driving feel, kind of right going along with the power feel, is the transmission and shifting. Now this car uses the 722.6 semi-automated manual transmission that Mercedes used in a bunch of their cars, starting in about the late 90s to all about 2008, I think it was the kind of when they started phasing the 722.6 out. So this car, the C55 is special in that it does have a full manual mode, or I say full, it's a slight nannied manual mode, but it's definitely more than just what a standard C-Class would have. Now this car has a manual mode, a comfort mode, and a sport mode, and I'll start by talking about those different modes. The comfort mode, and the difference between all these modes you feel the most with the shifting. And with comfort mode, you can tell the shift points are a lot lower. You know, it's going to make it less of a performance experience, and it's more for just daily driving. You know, get a little bit better gas mileage because your shift points are lower. And then sport mode kind of rings out the shifts a little bit more, but it's still going to shift for you. And so you'll get a little bit higher shift points, obviously a little bit sportier of a feel. And then full manual mode, you have most of the control with the paddle shifters here, or you can shift with the gear lever down below, the Tiptronic style. Now if you are banging off the rev limiter, I think the computer will come in and shift for you to obviously save the engine and transmission. But I have never done that, so I don't really want to try it per se. But they will deny you shift. So if you're driving slow and you're trying to shift into the higher gears, it will prevent you from going into those gears. So it's, it does have a little bit of nannying involved, but it's really not that bad, especially in the full manual mode, which I'm driving in right now. The next thing I'll talk about is like the shift times or shift feel. Now this was very, kind of when paddle shifters were starting to really catch on. Back in the mid 2000s, it was getting a lot more popular to have paddle shifters in a semi-automated manual versus a full stick shift. We got a biker up here, so. But this car with the shift times, it's actually really not bad. Obviously, if you compare it to like a modern day, like Porsche PDK or like a Lamborghini or Audi dual clutch, the shifts are gonna be really slow. But in retrospect, I mean, like the time from me pushing the paddle to when I get that gear change is really actually not bad at all. Like press and go. So, and the shift times vary depending on how you're driving the car. I've noticed that if you're under light acceleration or even medium acceleration, the shift points are pretty good, or shift times. I have noticed that when you are full out, like hard acceleration, the transmission does lag a little bit. So I don't have a straightaway right now to show you, but if I was under full throttle and I really ringed out the RPMs all the way up close to redline, it has a slight delay. And I noticed that especially like when I was doing my sound video and whatnot, that you will get a little bit of delay if you're really ringing out the RPMs into the higher speeds. But overall, this transmission has got a great feel to it. And the paddles are really cool to have. They do stay with the steering wheel. They're not like the type that don't move, so you do have to keep in mind that fact. But although when you're doing like spirited driving and whatnot, you're really never going to be steering more than like 90 degrees. So you know, the ability to shift with your fingers is a really nice feature to have. And you know, I think the overall manual feel is pretty nice, given the fact that it was an early kind of entry for Mercedes into the paddle shifter world. Now the paddles on this car are just little buttons on the back of the steering wheel, and you can do a mod actually where you can add real paddles that stick off the steering wheel, so you have a little bit more area to grip them than just these little buttons. And my buddy Anderson on his channel did that mod to a C55, which is a pretty cool mod. But overall, transmission in this car is pretty solid. I've said that in my reliability video. The part of the car that is really well built is the drivetrain, and the transmission is one of those. The only thing that it has a fault with is just that conductor plate that just needs to get swapped out. But after that, the drivetrain is very robust. And you know, I'm sure if I drove a Porsche like PDK or a Ferrari 458, all this stuff's got the dual clutch now, or a new Mercedes, this shift points will feel slow. But for the price point of this car and getting a manual transmission, it's a pretty good transmission for performance. Now, I've never tracked this car, so I don't know the full performance of the transmission, but a buddy of mine, his name is Dieter, he has a shop here in San Diego where he actually had a C55 track car, and he did say that after several laps, I think he was out at Willow Springs, the transmission got hot, and I think it went into like a limp mode. So that's just something to keep in mind if you do plan on tracking or auto-crossing the car. Auto-crossing probably wouldn't be an issue because you know, you're dealing with you know, short runs here and there, but with a track, when you're doing lap after lap, transmission might get a little bit hot, so you might have to look into maybe adding a aftermarket trans cooler if they have that. But overall, the shift points in this car are pretty fun. It's a 5-speed, so it's got good gear ratios. I never feel like first gear is too short or anything. You know, when I'm driving on these like spirited back roads, I'm mostly between second and third. So it's a great, the gear sets are great to be in, to kind of have a little fun, and you're kind of, you know, it always allows you to be downshifting and upshifting, so you're never just staying in one gear, because I know some cars have that problem. But overall, I think the transmission in this car is great. Okay, so if you notice I'm getting a little sweaty, it's just I'm choosing to keep the air conditioning off, obviously, to maybe have a little extra performance right now because I'm driving on this nice back road, although I was stuck behind this Lexus, but mostly because I didn't want the wind interrupting the camera because it's right by the vent. But the next point on the talking point is traction. So this is an interesting point to talk about, just because it is a relatively high torque, high power car that is rear wheel drive. Now traction, the biggest thing I've noticed with the traction in this car is it all mostly is going to depend on your tires and your tire temp. If you're driving on a cold road, like especially at night, and your tires are cold, you will most likely break traction in the lower gears, accelerating from a stop or slow speeds. So that's something to keep in mind, you know, just to be careful, obviously. But it does allow for the car to be a little bit fun. If you want to kick the back end out, you can most definitely do that. But the thing I have noticed is that also depending on your tires is, you know, once you get them up to temp, and it's the asphalt temp is a little bit higher, the car sticks pretty good. I've never, when I've been doing like spirited back road driving, have I ever felt that the car was unstable with the back end. It's always felt very planted. I do have a little bit wider tires on the car. I believe stock the car comes with 265s or 255s. I'm not entirely sure. I'm running 275s in the back, so I do get a little bit of wheel rub because of that. But because I think I'm running a little bit wider of a tire, it allows me to have that extra little bit of traction, and I've never felt that it's been unsafe. Let's see if I can break it loose right here just a little bit. Okay, so see, it just stuttered just a little bit, but it was very little slippage of the rear tires, and that was pretty much a full throttle acceleration. So, and you know, it's about 82 right now, so the asphalt temp's probably 90 to 100, somewhere around there. And I've been driving for a little bit, so the tires probably got a little bit of temp in them. So the traction feels really good. The car, I mentioned this in my reliability, like ownership video, the car feels very safe. It feels like a very planted car, and it just kind of eats the road very nicely. I have experienced a little bit, slight bit of understeer, but not a whole lot if you come into a corner a little bit too hot. So just keep that in mind. And with the traction, I'd say the biggest thing is if you live in an area with a wet climate where it's raining often, that's when you're going to see the most slippage, because you're delivering all that power and torque to just those two rear wheels. So like any rear wheel drive car, you're just gonna have to be a little bit extra careful if it's wet out. But this car overall has got great traction, you know, especially, you know, if you get a good set of tires. You know, I've had great experience with these Hankooks I have on the back, or if you have the budget and the wallet to do Michelin's, I'm sure you won't be disappointed with those. But that's a performance mod that is often overlooked with any car, or is just a good set of tires. You'd be surprised at how much better your car will handle when you've got a decent set of tires on it that have got good life and tread in it, especially tires that can handle a little bit of wet conditions as well. So, but overall traction feel of this car is it does feel very planted, but it's just enough that it'll be a little bit fun if you want to kick the back end out, but if you're going on a back driving like kind of twisty road like I am now, it's a perfect car that feels planted, and it's not gonna, you know, be too much. But the big thing is, you know, with any car, you don't want to give it power when you're turning, obviously, because with the rear wheel drive you will then kick the back end out, because when you brake, obviously you're front loading the car, so all your weight is off the back, so you're gonna be much more likely to break it loose. But that gets into a whole different point of driving dynamics and whatnot. But overall, the traction in this car is really great, and it feels like a very safe and planted car to drive. So the next point that I want to talk about in this video is the braking. Now, this car does have upgraded brakes compared to the standard C-Class. It's got 4-piston Brembos in the front and 2 pistons, I believe Brembos also in the rear. The front rotors are larger, and they're drilled and not slotted, but they're drilled rotors, so they're supposed to obviously help with cooling. But this car, the braking feel, it fits the amount of power this car has. Obviously, if you're going to be putting in a lot of performance mods in this car, you're getting up to like 500-600, closer to where the E55, S55, all those guys are at with the superchargers. You might want to look at upgrading the brakes, but you know, the brake feel of this car, it suits the weight of the car, and it suits the amount of power the car has really nicely. I felt that, you know, in an emergency situation, you know, you could brake very quickly and come to a stop very quickly, and for a performance situation, it handles the power and weight of the car just fine. But a common mod that people will do is they will take a brake kit from an E55 or S55 that have the larger 6-piston in the front and 4-piston in the rear. You can increase your brake feel just that much more. But you might even be able to get away with just some racing brake pads. So on here I have the carbon ceramic pads that, you know, help a lot with brake dust, but they're also performance too. And you can get race pads too that might grab a little bit better and perform better at higher temperatures. Now again, because I've never tracked this car, I don't know how these brakes will handle heat, and once they get heat soaked a little bit, I don't know if they'll get kind of spongy there. So that's kind of uncharted territory for me with that. But you know, for just like back road driving like this, and even autocrossing, where you're not really cooking the brakes up to high temps, they suit this car very nicely. So the next talking point I'm going to talk about is the steering, suspension, and handling. So those kind of all go hand in hand together. The first I'll talk about is the steering feel. Now, the steering feel with this car, the way it's built, it's got a fairly large, you know, beefy 5.4 liter V8 over the front axle, or, you know, steering rack. The steering does feel a little bit heavy. It's not it's not very quick, but it doesn't feel like unresponsive. So it's kind of a fairly heavy steering rack, but it's still enough of a good feel. It's a hydraulic rack, so you're not dealing with the electronic steering rack. So it still has a very direct input, but the steering does feel a little bit heavy just because of the weight over the front end of the car. So just keep that in mind. But I think it's a great feel for the car. It suits the car because this car isn't like a little Miata. It is after all, a performance sedan. So it's going to be a little bit heavier because it's a luxury car in the grand scheme of things. But it kind of aids the traction feel. It just feels very planted. And I've never felt that the steering is loose, and it's still pretty direct, relatively speaking, for a car that's 14, 15 years old. The next is suspension and handling. Now, this car I have is on completely stock suspension, and I think the suspension in this car, it doesn't need to be touched. Maybe you could put lowering springs on it, but to firm it up a little bit and give you a better aesthetic look. But the car, it's got a little bit of roll. You can feel it when you're in the turns, but it's nothing that's like, oh, that's a red flag. It's a very, again, planted and safe feeling experience with the handling. And you don't get a lot of squat or dive when you're under hard acceleration or braking. It's a very, just overall, it's a stable car with the handling feel. And with the stock suspension, I mean, I'm pretty happy with it. Sometimes the car does get a little bit upset over, certain bumps and dips. But for the most part, it eats up the road. Like this back road I'm on, it's by no means flat and smooth. And it's just eating up all these bumps really well. And it's never to the point where I feel that the car is unsafe. So it's just an overall good, it feels planted. If I'm gonna say one word repeatedly in this video, it's gonna be that this car just feels planted. So like I'm going on this pretty technical section right now, and it just feels like a blast. It's just eating these turns up. Now we're in a really technical section. So hard braking right here, pretty deep or steep left turn, and the car, it doesn't ever feel, you don't feel body roll. You hardly feel any body roll. Again, braking here, left turn, little bit of body roll, but nothing that's unstable. Like it just, again, it feels planted. Oh, this car just puts a smile on your face. Like there's just no two ways about it. And with the power and everything right now, and the brake feel, which I'll get into in a second, like, oh man, this is just a blast to drive, and it's just eating up this road like crazy. And you could push this car harder, but again, this goes back to the power feel. The amount of power that this car has is the perfect amount for this type of back road. It's not to the point where you're going to be wringing this out and where it's unstable. I'm actually going to flip around here so we can do that section again. But it's just enough power to kind of get to about the 80% performance range of this car, to where you can have fun without being unsafe. And again, it's just the suspension feel is just so dialed in from the factory. I think this car is overlooked in this area of performance cars. When you're looking at the BMW, the Audi, I have driven an E46, and that car does feel similar. I think that car is a little bit lighter because the E46 is a two-door, and this car I think is just built a little bit heavier, but they both feel very solid. So I think the overall suspension feel of this car is it's great. It's gonna eat up a few more of the turns here. Oh, the blips on the downshift, and then the overrun if you downshift. Yeah. And going back to the shifting, like, this is the amount of car you get for the price point that these are at nowadays, it's just remarkable. We're getting little pops right now in the exhaust. Accelerate out of the turn, and it feels planted. Like, I'm pushing it pretty good right now, and it's not. Bit of body roll there, so you still get a little bit. After all, it is a heavy, performance sedan, but it's just a fun car. And I've never done a driving review video like this, so I apologize if I'm not the most well-spoken right now, because I'm focusing on driving and talking at the same time. But again, so what were we on? We were on suspension feel. So this car just feels great. I love the handling feel of this car. Now we're stuck behind a few other cars, so we don't have to worry about going as quick, but it eats up the road, like, and I haven't driven a ton of cars, but I have driven a bunch of different performance cars, and there are cars that obviously outperform this, in handling, suspension, power. But I think just for the price point that these are at, you can pick up a really well looked after C55 with relatively low miles for probably like close to $10,000-$12,000, and I think that's a great performance bargain for being a European kind of muscle sports car. Next part of this car, this driving review, and this is such a large factor with any car and a performance car, is the sound. Now, again, I have some exhaust mods. I've got headers. I've deleted the resonator and the secondary cat, so this car is going to be a little bit louder than a stock C55 would be. But the sound of this car is just so great. And a part of me, even, and I don't know, I just might be biased because, I really love this car. A part of me thinks this car at certain sound points kind of sounds like the Koenigsegg V8. It just has that similar sound to it, and it's a very unique V8. It doesn't sound like the American V8s. It's got like a more refined V8 sound to it. Now I'm stuck behind this Mustang and this truck here, so I can't really open it up right now, but when I get around these guys, like, I'll open it up a little bit and you guys can hear what I'm talking about. When this car is stock, it's quieter, so even if you don't have the cash to do headers, just the resonator and secondary cat delete, which you'll still pass smog with, is enough to really just give this car a little bit extra oomph and like muscle, especially at lower RPMs. And then the headers, if you have the budget to do headers, that opens up the sound a lot at the higher RPMs and gives it that good raspy sound, not a bad raspy, but a good raspy sound like the 63 series AMGs have. It's a very cool sound. And then the other thing that I've gotten asked is their drone. So right now I'm cruising about 45-50 miles an hour, and I can bear it's just enough sound so I know that, like, okay, I'm in a C55, it's got a V8, but it's nothing like crazy drone that is unbearable. So if you're looking to daily drive this car, and you want to do some exhaust mods, you won't have to worry about drone hardly at all. If you're going up a hill and you've got some load on the engine, even at 2,000-3,000 RPMs, you'll hear a little bit more, but it's nothing unbearable, especially if you're playing a little bit of music. But from my take, if you have a car like this, you want to hear the V8, even if you're driving it on the freeway. It's a very fun, refined sound here. So I'm about to flip around behind, or I'm going to turn around again and do this section, and I'll open it up, and you guys can hear what I'm talking about. Well, I hope this truck doesn't make this U-turn. Okay, here we go. And on downshifts, the other thing too is on downshifts, when you got some heat going, you'll hear a little bit of kind of cracks and pops. So here we go. Oh, that's such a fun sound. So it's got that raspiness to it, and you know, when you downshift and you let the RPMs kind of overrun a little bit, you will get some pops. Crest, bank right. So let's do a little blip downshift. RPMs overrun. Yeah, it's a great sound, and I think it for some reason it just sounds, it's got that sound like a Koenigsegg V8. It's a very different sound than a American V8. I think American V8s are a little less refined, and they kind of have a more, you know, rawness to them. This has just got a refined nature that, you know, when you're just cruising around, it sounds very subtle, but when you want to open it up and have some fun, you can definitely do that. So big thing with this car is it's got an amazing sound note that just, it'll put a smile on your face all the time, especially if you have the means to mod the exhaust a little bit. I mean, who doesn't love that? So I'm gonna shut up here for a second and just go through this technical section, and then let the exhaust just speak for itself. So again, moral of the story is the exhaust in this car it's great. The sound this M113 V8 makes it's very unique, and it's like no other. So again, if you can mod the exhaust a little bit, you'll be able to squeeze a little bit more sound out of it and have a lot of fun with it. Next point I want to talk about is just interior comfort and kind of your driving position. And this is a very important point that I think is sometimes overlooked in car reviews, is because this is your input zone to the car. The first point that I want to talk about are the seats. Now in this car, it's got the special seats just for the C55. They're the Napa leather, so they're the nice quality leather, not like the cheap vinyl leather that other C classes of this era have. And it's not like the dimpled kind of leather. It's that smooth kind that it feels really nice. And the bolstering on these seats, both on like your rib cage area and where your thighs are, like they're not uncomfortable, but they hold you planted really well, from, you know, because I'm on this twisty back road and I can really feel the bolstering just holding me in this seat a lot better than like a stock standard seat would. So that's one point of this car that I really love. The seats are really comfortable. They've got a heated feature. It does get a little bit hot because they're black, so just keep that in mind. And if you do, there are C55s that are made with a white, like cream colored interior. I'm not the biggest fan of it because it gets dirty really easily, but so the black just gets a little hot if you live in a hot area. But you know, the seats are great. It's a really nice feature to have on this car. The next point that I want to talk about is with the interior kind of comfort is the steering wheel. Now this steering wheel is special to this C55 and I think the SLK. It's a 3-spoke steering wheel, and it's got some nice thumb points here. So if you're holding it at 9 and 3, It kind of, you got a little bit of extra beefiness on the wheel right there, and it's also, again, a very comfortable steering wheel to have, and to drive in a performance, like kind of with a performance mindset. The only thing that I would gripe about the steering wheel is that the leather, this is a leather wrapped wheel, but over time with use, it gets a little bit slippery, and it being hot right now, you know, my hands are sweating a little bit. The wheel does get a little bit slick, so that's the only thing I complain about. But one thing I've noticed is if I condition and clean the wheel, it helps a little bit with that. But the wheel just does get a little bit slippery after a while. So just keep that in mind. You know, you could always use driving gloves to help with that, but you know, I've never felt the need to do that. But yeah, it's a good steering wheel. I like the shape of it and the feel in your hand. It's somewhat thick, and it kind of gives you a good like grip point, and you feel, you know, really in control. But it just does get a little bit slippery. The next point that I want to talk about with kind of like comfort and driving experience is your seating position. Now this is kind of a plus and minus. The seating position in this car, in my opinion, really isn't much different than a standard C-Class. You obviously know you're in kind of, you feel you're in a performance car because of the side bolstering on the seats, but your height relative to, you know, the ground and your viewpoint to the road doesn't really feel much different than a standard C-Class. And I did own a C240 before this, so I kind of was able to directly compare when I got this car 8 years ago between the two cars. Now you can lower the seat down a little bit and you get a little bit more of a driving kind of sports car feel being lower to the ground, but for the most part, you know, it just kind of feels like another everyday car, and to some degree that's what this is. A lot of people will daily drive these things, and you know, that's what they want, and it's just enough with the seats and everything. I think the nicer seats just gives you that little bit of an extra feel when you want to drive this car with a performance mindset. Sorry, had to do it. One last thing I forgot to mention related to driving experience is that the type of wheel and tire you have on the car is also going to affect the driving feel to some degree as well. You know, I've got 19s on all four corners with this car, and I believe stock the car came with 17s in the front and 18s in the rear, or it might be 18s all around. So if you're running a little bit smaller of a rim or a wheel, you can run a bigger tire, so it's going to give you a little bit different of a driving feel. And so with the bigger rim that I have now, the 19s, it might have a little bit more of a harsh feel to it, but it's nothing unbearable. Like I said, I was driving on those back roads pretty, you know, with a pretty spirited manner, and it was eating up a lot of the bumps and not disrupting the car a whole lot. Overall, what is my overall experience with the C55? I think it is a great first AMG, or even a great first like European sports car for anybody to get into. It's a practical car, you know, with the 4 seats and the trunk. I mean, it's pretty much a standard C-Class. It's just got the big V8 in the front, and it allows you to have more fun when you want to. It's a relatively simple car. I said this in my reliability video. It's a relatively simple car. There's not a lot of crazy systems on it. Like the upper series AMGs have the airmatic suspension and all these other sensors and whatnot. This car is very simple, straight to the point, and it's relatively easy to work on. You know, the front end is a little bit squished with the engine being kind of crammed in there with the bigger V8, but it's nothing unbearable. So just keep that in mind. And the parts are relatively cheap, even if you get your parts from like a company like FCP Euro, you get genuine OEM parts with a lifetime warranty for a pretty dang good price. That's where I started getting a lot of my parts from after I had that issue with the alternator from O'Reilly's. But it's a great first car, and I think I said it many times throughout the video. It feels like a very solid and planted car. It feels safe. You can tell, like when you open and close the door, it just feels really well built and put together. and when you're driving it, it feels very planted. It's a heavy steering feel, so it doesn't feel like the steering is not twitchy. It's heavy, but it's not twitchy, but it's still responsive. So now I'm going like this, it's still got input, but it's not like some cars where it's very darty. So that also makes it safer and more planted when you're driving it in a more spirited manner. And again, the traction feel and the suspension feel, it just eats up a lot of the bumps and different parts of the road without giving the car an unsafe experience, especially when you're driving it quicker. So I just can't speak highly enough of this car. Again, for the price point, I think it's a great performance car to get into. The sound, again, is amazing. The shifting feel for being an early rendition of the 5-speed semi-automated manual transmission, it still shifts great. If you might have a few issues if you're tracking the car when the transmission gets hot, but nothing I've experienced with doing back roads and autocross and stuff like that, it still shifts great. It does lag a little bit under full throttle, but you're not doing that all the time, especially on a back road like this. The power is very usable. It's something that you can, I was talking with my friend about this, is the reason why certain cars with lower power I think are more fun even than a higher power car like a Hellcat. Like a Hellcat would be a really fun car in a straight line, but on a back road like this, you can only use probably half the power. So I think being able to push this car to closer to its limits and closer to its red line of peak power, it makes the car feel more fun and gives you a more fun experience because you're getting closer to the limits of this car. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't always mean more power means better, unless you're going for straight line speed. But again, I'm going on these back roads and the car just eats this up like no other. So I think I've talked on enough about this car. I hope I covered enough areas that kind of talk about the overall driving experience of this car. But if you guys, as always, if you have any questions or comments about the C55, please let me know and I will be happy to answer them in the comment section below. But again, highly recommend this car. So thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, definitely hit that subscribe button for more content to come. And other than that, I will see you guys in the next one.